In this second segment on the politics of Congress, we're going to clean up some of the election issues that we didn't get to yet. We'll be talking about gerrymandering, midterm elections, presidential coattails, that sort of thing. And then we'll move on to the last section, which will be Congress's functions. And we'll see that those functions are to represent we the people, to legislate for the nation, and to perform oversight, checks and balances vis-a-vis, in particular, the executive branch. Gerrymandering. Oh boy. Can we talk about how you draw electoral lines for purposes of representation in the House? Don't fall asleep on me now, people. All right, gerrymandering. You may have heard about that recently. It's become kind of a big deal in our politics and not in a good way. So gerrymandering, right, is an effort to redraw electoral lines to benefit one party or the other. It goes all the way back to the beginning of American politics. So nothing new there. So a couple things to talk about here. The U.S. Supreme Court in recent years has held repeatedly that partisan gerrymanders, sky's the limit, right? No limitation on what states can do when it comes to partisan gerrymandering. As long as each district, right, has about the same population as every other district. That's the one cornerstone that the courts do demand, is that these congressional districts have to each be the same size in terms of population. But what the population sort of looks like partisan-wise within each district, that's to be determined without significant judicial intervention at all. In most states, the legislature carries out this process of line drawing. Is that a little bit like the fox guarding the hen house? Yeah, it is. It is. And then in some states, they've made it more neutral, more bipartisan, more professional. In fact, we have a couple of those right around us here. Arizona has done that. Utah has done that. And California, until recently, did that. Okay. I'll come back to that in a moment. So right away, right, you can see that partisanship is going to be pretty important in most states like Nevada. Where the court has drawn lines is when it comes to racial gerrymanders in particular. And they've said the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause generally forbids taking race into account when drawing these boundaries. And in fact, as I noted right previously in the Louisiana v. Calais case just a few months ago or a few weeks ago, the court said that our previous reading of the Voting Rights Act, right, that in some cases, line drawing groups like legislatures might need to take race into account to make sure that black or minority voters get a good chance to elect the representatives of their own choosing. That's generally, we're really not going to read the Voting Rights Act that way anymore. We're getting rid of that interpretation. The language, if you look at it, is pretty broad. It's ambiguous. And the court is saying, yeah, the courts before us got it wrong for decade after decade after decade. And now we're going to go in a new direction and say the Voting Rights Act does not, almost never requires taking race into account when drawing lines to benefit racial minorities. So they've really gone hardcore towards the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause forbidding racial gerrymandering. And why that becomes tricky, I think I've already made clear, right? In cases of that, right, that partisan gerrymandering, where sky's the limit. Where's the line between partisan gerrymanders and racial gerrymanders, especially in the American South? They're indistinguishable. So right now that the court has said what they've said in that Louisiana case, right, a lot of legislators in the South are going back to the drawing board and they're redrawing their lines to get rid of black majority districts. And their argument is, we're not targeting black majority districts, we're targeting Democratic Party districts. And we're trying to benefit the Republican Party, not white people. And we're trying to screw over the Democratic Party, not people of color. But right, some would say, well, how can you distinguish between those two things? They overlap so heavily, especially in the South. So conservatives are thrilled with that new reading of the Voting Rights Act. Progressives are horrified, and it is what it is. And what's unusual about the recent sort of flurry of gerrymanders in both blue and red states, but mostly in red states, because it's a little easier to do it in red states, because blue states, like I said, some blue states like California had said, no, we're going to make it a more bipartisan, party neutral process. And they put up barriers to protect that. And now that they want to change that quickly, it's hard to change those things quickly. They managed to pull it off in California, not in Virginia. So blue states now are like, why did we ever do that? Why did we ever do that? We'll change it, but it's going to take us until the next cycle to change it. Because, right, our political warfare has gotten more intense as we've become more polarized. And why has that happened? Trump, about maybe six months ago, said, hey, Republicans, you're going to lose the House in November. Gerrymander the crap wherever you can to create as many safe Republican seats as possible. Go, go, go. And Republican states have said, great, well, that's exactly what we're going to do. What makes that particularly unusual, right, is number one, the president calling for gerrymanders. I don't think that's ever happened before. And number two, right, gerrymanders typically have been done once every 10 years after a 10-year census. So it's an ugly process on both sides for sure, but it's only been ugly once every 10 years. And now we're we're in the middle of there's no census until 2030, but the gerrymanders are commencing, and now I think we're going to get gerrymanders every 2 years in blue and red states. It's really ugly. It's really ugly. And Trump sort of kicked that off because he's an extraordinary president. Take that as you wish. He's an extraordinary president. So our political warfare carried out through gerrymanders has been with us from the beginning, but it's gotten a lot more intense and a lot more frequent and a lot more cynical. And it's just part of the sign of the times, right? Our democracy is in some trouble. This is an example of that. This is not fantastic. And we always had this sort of low-level warfare, and now it's super intense warfare. And that's, again, a sign of the times for sure. All right. Okay, so what do we have here? Two ways of thinking about the ability of Congress to represent we the people, which again is its core function. First one, right, would be demographic representation. That's the idea that Congress should look something like, right, the people that they represent. So to what extent do we see the demographic profile of we the people reflected in the demographic profile of the U.S. Congress? Well, it's a work in progress. So what you've seen, right, is over the years, 2015, right, somewhat diverse, 2017, more diverse, 2019, progress, 2021, even more progress, right? So we're moving in, and if you think demographic representation is important, and I think it is, we're moving in the right direction, right? So Congress as a whole, which includes, right, both the Senate and the House, about 23% people of color. Now nationally, what are we on that? Let me think for a minute. I think we're around somewhere in the mid-30s, right? So we're not there yet. We got a ways to go if you think Congress should be as diverse as we the people. But again, moving in a good direction. Although note, that number is slightly inflated because it includes representatives in the House that are non-voting members from the territories and the District of Columbia. So places like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Marianas Islands, the District of Columbia. So it includes those representatives I think maybe all or nearly all are people of color, and yet they can't vote, right? So that's slightly overstated still. It's a lot of progress. And Congress as a whole, gender diversity, 27%. You know, I've heard that the gender mix in America as a whole is about 50-50. So if that's the goal, and I don't know that it is, but it might be, but if that's the goal, right, you would say progress, but a ways to go perhaps. Um, Although again, I think that includes in the House non-voting members from the territories and DC, and I think those are either all or disproportionately women. So again, slightly overstated. Also worth noting on both of those counts, both race and gender, the House is more representative of we the people, the Senate is less so. So you see pumped up numbers in the House on these measures, and then somewhat less impressive numbers, if you will, in the U.S. Senate. The Senate is less diverse, gender and race-wise, than the House of Reps, which should hardly be shocking, right? Because historically, the Senate has been about representing sort of more of the aristocracy, as it were, the powerful. And those are all statewide elections, right? And it can be harder for candidates of color, especially, to win statewide races, whereas they might be able to win, right, in a congressional district that's centered in an urban area. All right. Now others would say, hey, wait a minute, that's the wrong measure, or it's not the only measure of representation. Another way, right, to think about representation is policy or political representation. Does Congress, by and large, do what a majority of we the people want them to do? You would say about 2/3 of the time, yes. About 2/3 of the time, yes. So on that measure, you would say, Congress does pretty well. They represent their constituents as a whole pretty effectively about 2/3 of the time. And some might say, right, well, maybe you don't want it to be 3/3 of the time. Maybe you don't want it to be 100%, because sometimes we the people want sketchy things, like Jim Crow, for example, in the South back in the day. Alternatively, right, you might say, well, the reason it's 2/3 is sometimes, right, members of Congress are responding to the desires of powerful interest groups, which may not be the same as the desires of we the people as a whole. All right, so those are two broad ways of thinking about the ability of Congress to represent we the people. There's the demographic angle, and there's the policy or political angle. Both of them, I think, are worth thinking about and considering as a way to measure the ability of Congress to represent we the people. Another key function of Congress, in addition to representation, is legislation. It is called a legislative body for a reason. Its primary job in many ways is to legislate on behalf of we the people as a way of representing them. If you ever go there, if you get a chance, go there. I would certainly suggest it. Go to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., sit in on a session of the House or the Senate. And what you typically see is a lot of nothing going on. Sometimes members will rush onto the floor, cast a vote, and rush back out again. If you're looking for dramatic speeches and so forth on one side or the other of a bill, good luck with that. Typically, these things have been worked out ahead of time. The vote on the floor is just a mechanical sort of process. All of the stuff that's gone on before, typically in committee and subcommittee, which is where legislation often gets worked out, right? These are committees that specialize in certain areas, such as, let's say, the Judiciary Committee, the Agricultural Committee, the Space and Technology Committee. All of these various committees specialize in working on legislation in particular areas. That's where an awful lot of the work gets done. Members of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party on these committees, that they're the ones hashing out the content of these bills, and then they're brought to the floor for a quick vote. So the vote itself is really not where the action is. That's more for show. The actual work, typically in committee and subcommittee, and of course in informal gatherings between various key members of Congress talking to one another about, let's do this, let's not do that, this will help the party, that won't help the party. Again, all of that's, the process is often not all that transparent. Again, if you're looking for the dramatic speeches on the floor and then a vote, very little of that goes on. I wish that it did, but it doesn't. only in the movies, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. We could also say this. The majority party in both houses, they're the ones who mostly control the legislative process. They dominate the legislative process. So, what's the situation right now in Congress? Republicans have a majority in the House. They dominate and run that legislative process in the House. What about the Senate? Republicans control that chamber as well. They also control the legislative process, although in the Senate there's a difference, right? In the Senate, they have a filibuster, which means that the minority party can threaten a filibuster, and typically it takes 60 votes to override that filibuster to invoke cloture. Although we know that Reid changed that rule recently and said that on presidential nominations to the courts, and I think maybe the executive branch as well. No longer can you filibuster, but you can on, I believe, ordinary legislation. So that gives the minority party more influence in the Senate, very little influence in the House, where they do not have the filibuster. Leadership is key in terms of who runs the legislative process. Speaker of the House, who represents the majority party in the House, House Majority Leader, House Minority Leader, House Majority Whip, House Minority Whip. Second in command, basically, are the whips. Some people below them as well. Each side has a leadership team. Harry Reid currently, right, Senate Minority Leader. Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader. In the House, John Boehner from Ohio was the representative Speaker of the House, and Nancy Pelosi is House Minority Leader. So the leadership plays a key role in shaping the legislative process. Rank and file mostly fall into line. Leadership mostly runs the show. And we should also say this, the legislative process as it's set up in America, many ways in which legislation can fail. Very difficult to push things through. Many points where things can be blocked and changed dramatically and vetoed by the president and so forth. So the legislative process is always extremely uphill. Getting things through is often a minor miracle, but things certainly do get through. All right, let's move on. So the third sort of macro function I want to talk about here with regard to Congress is their function as sort of checks and balances to the executive branch in particular. I mean, they also have checks and balances, right, vis-a-vis the federal courts in terms of Senate advice and consent on nominees to those courts. They have some power over the federal court's jurisdiction, on and on. But the big one here really is all about checking and balancing presidential power. Checks and balances, right? That was the design of the founding fathers. Rather brilliant. They didn't anticipate political parties. I don't know why. I don't know why, but they didn't. So it turns out, right, Congress is very good at checking and balancing presidential power when the president and the Congress do not share the same party identity, right? So when you have a president of one party and a Senate and a House of the other party, yeah, you're going to get lots of checks and balances. And that's largely a good thing, right? Limited government, design of the founders. But as it turns out, as our parties evolved, right, it became apparent pretty quickly. And it's more so, I think, even now today because of our polarization. When the president is of one party and both houses of Congress are of the same party, you get very few checks and balances at all. That's a problem. That's a problem. And it's currently what we have right now, and Trump is exploiting that with a severe aggression. He's an historically consequential president, and he's making extraordinary claims of executive power, and Congress is mostly going along out of party loyalty, and Trump has shown that he has absolute control over the Republican Party, right? He's been essentially evicting disloyal Republicans from the party over and over again, most recently in some primaries that you may have seen in the news. So Republicans have learned, man, if you cross Trump, your career is probably over. And some of his more devoted followers might even come after you very personally and threaten your life and the life of your family. So cross Trump at your peril. So that's why the lack of checks and balances. Now, as Trump moves towards the second half of his current term in office, his power becomes less. Any president's power becomes less, right? Once they're in the last 2 years of their last term in office, because they can no longer influence elections to any significant degree. They're never going to be on the ballot again, right? And so that's when you start to get more pushback, even from the president's own party, when the president becomes a lame duck towards the end of his or her last term in office. That is in Trump's future, and that makes him no different than every other president. Nothing unusual about that. Even if Republicans control both houses after November, which is pretty unlikely. So that's some of what's been going on here with regard to this function of Congress. The founders didn't anticipate that. They thought, oh, Congress will always check and balance the president because they'll have institutional concerns about maintaining their own power. But turns out, well, it depends on political party dynamics. Another way that Congress can conduct oversight of the executive branch is through investigations. These, I don't know, they tend to be more sound and fury and less substance. They tend to be very theatrical, very planned, very partisan. They don't really have any legal consequences at all. They can recommend charges, criminal charges to the DOJ during an investigation, but an investigation is just an investigation, and it's almost always just to score political points on one side or the other. So there's a lot of sound and fury there, a lot of light and fire, but often not much meaningful political action on that front typically. Another way that Congress can conduct oversight is through budgetary hearings. Really boring, right? Quite honestly, if you have C-SPAN 3, maybe you've seen some of these hearings. It's when, right? So who signs the checks that funds the federal government? Congress. Right. So every year Congress says, yo, whether it's the IRS or the Department of Transportation or the Pentagon or the Department of State, Department of Agriculture, right? Every year they're going to say, hey, we gave you this much money to spend on enforcing laws. How did you enforce those laws and how did you spend that money? Are you using we the people's money wisely? You get a lot of checks and balances there, although again, a lot of it depends on political party, but you're going to get some real checks and balances there. And that's often out of the public eye, but it is meaningful. And you can also get, right, checks and balances coming from the Congress, specifically from the Senate. When the president nominates somebody, right, to serve on the federal courts or in the federal bureaucracy in terms of leadership, the Senate, right, provides advice and consent on those nominations. Typically, they give their consent, but not always. They push back from time to time. An extreme example, speaking broadly here, of how Congress conducts oversight of the executive branch, right, would be impeachments. We'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about the presidency. That's an extreme form of checks and balances, right? Impeachment. The impeachment, by the way, is the accusation of high crimes and misdemeanors from the House of Reps. The House would develop articles, what are called articles of impeachment, right? Specific charges of high crimes and misdemeanors, maybe one, maybe multiple articles. Each of those articles is debated in the House, voted on in the House. Any article that gets a majority vote goes to the Senate for a trial on guilt or innocence of high crimes and misdemeanors. And the thing, though, in the Senate trial, right, is you need 2/3 supermajority to convict. It's never happened. It's never happened. Nixon left office before it got that far. Andrew Johnson, during Reconstruction, not resigned. He got really quiet after he was impeached, but survived his Senate trial by one vote. So it served its larger purpose because it forced him into the background. Clinton was impeached and not convicted in the Senate and came out more popular than ever. And Trump was impeached twice and got reelected in 2024. So you would say in two of those, we only have 4 cases in history, so you don't want to impute too much from only 4 cases. But right, the 2 earlier cases were successful at checking and balancing presidential power, although no convictions in the Senate. The 2 most recent ones, if anything, may be counterproductive. So it's not clear anymore in the modern era if impeachment makes sense anymore. It's almost like a nuclear bomb. It's such an extreme weapon. Who wants to use it? How are you going to get 2/3 in the Senate? So all right.